After Eisenhower, we have President John F. Kennedy, who comes up with something called the flexible response, where they would respond to some of these different things in ways to prevent really nuclear escalation. Um, he tried to cooperate more with Latin American countries as a way to kind of prevent another Cold War problem. He set up one of the most lasting things of his administration was the Peace Corps, where hundreds of American students go all over the world to help build churches and schools and houses and get good water and all kinds of wonderful things. He sets up the nuclear test ban treaty with the major nuclear powers to try to prevent some of that poison from getting into the United States and other parts of the atmosphere. And probably most telling is he starts to send military advisors to South Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese dictator Ngo Dinh Diem. This is beginning of the escalation of the Vietnam conflict. In 1961, Khrushchev decides to build a wall in Berlin to prevent any East Berliners from going to the West. It's all about getting the communists to be walled off from the capitalist influence. Kennedy let him get away with this, and he took a big hit for, being too nice to these guys. And he really had to come back with a better foreign policy after that. Probably the biggest foreign policy success of the entire Kennedy administration was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union decided to put intermediate-range ballistic missiles, nuclear-tipped missiles, in Cuba, which was 90 miles from the United States. And, of course, everybody in America freaked out. It was considered to be one of the most dangerous times in history because the U.S. was adamant that those missile bases leave. People on both sides were ratcheting up the rhetoric and talking and trying to think about trying to do a first strike, and things just got worse and worse until Kennedy decided to stop listening to the warmongers and set up something called a quarantine, a blockade from Cuba that said that no ships would be allowed in. And the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for missiles being removed from Turkey within 10 years. And what's interesting about this is that the missiles that were in Turkey that the U.S. had were scheduled to be decommissioned anyway. So Kennedy was able to convince the Soviet Union to get rid of these missiles that threatened America itself, and did it without giving anything up. So this is his biggest foreign policy victory, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But for 13 days in November of 1962, the world was on the brink of nuclear holocaust. Of course, after Kennedy is assassinated, his vice president takes over, and Lyndon B. Johnson is much more of a war hawk, especially when it comes to preventing South Vietnam from being taken over by communists. And we can see the beginning of full-scale U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War with Lyndon Johnson's succession to the presidency. The spark or incident that really created this movement to attack North Vietnam and to get involved in this in a full-scale way was when U.S. warships were fired upon by North Vietnamese warships. Now, Johnson and the administration said that they were in international waters, but the reality is that they were way too close to North Vietnam and the North Vietnamese considered it an act of war. Congress passed a resolution authorizing Johnson to send combat troops to Vietnam. And he does. And this is really what you can say is the beginning of the Vietnam War in 1964. It also escalated with a bombardment of North Vietnam called Operation Rolling Thunder, wherein the United States sent jets and bombers over North Vietnam every single day, trying to bomb North Vietnam out of commission. From 1964 to 1969, the United States keeps sending troops into Vietnam. The full-scale draft is in place where Americans are forced to go join the Army and go fight in Vietnam. At the highest point, the United States had 540,000 soldiers in Vietnam fighting. And they're doing pretty well without any kind of real mission other than protect Vietnam. But things look really bad on TV. So Americans are starting to be more and more against Vietnam. And it all comes to a head at the Tet Offensive in January 1968. The Viet Cong, the guerrilla troops from North Vietnam and in South Vietnam, launched a surprise attack on Vietnamese New Year, Tet. The United States beats back most of those attacks, but it looks like, in fact, they completely destroy the Viet Cong. They force North Vietnam back into North Vietnam, and it's a complete and clear victory. However, they had spent all this time telling the American people how close the United States was to winning the war, and then all of a sudden, the enemy has enough gumption to launch this massive surprise attack all throughout South Vietnam, and the Americans just think that this is a losing war after this battle, the Tet Offensive. Here you can see some of the photos of it. Two of the most famous ones are here on the right. This is after a napalm attack. These kids had suffered through a napalm attack. The bottom right, you've got a South Vietnamese intelligence official holding a gun on what was considered to be a North Vietnamese spy. About 2 seconds after this photo was taken, the guy on the right was dead. And it just made Americans really thought that they had no respect for the rule of law, and didn't think that they should be supporting people who would do something like this. However, what is not mentioned very often is that this guy really was a spy and was responsible for the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers with his espionage. So probably the most photographed and videoed war in history is the Vietnam War, and you can see examples of it here. Another massive aspect of the Cold War was the space race. And I told you in response to the Soviet Union putting a satellite in space, the United States really ramped up its education and its scientific endeavors. When the Soviet Union put a man in space, Yuri Gagarin, the U.S. really started to push even more. So they created the Mercury program, where Alan Shepard becomes the first man in space. John Glenn, who just died here last year, or in 2015, he is the first American to orbit the Earth in 1962. President Kennedy said that the only thing that keeps America from doing what it wants to do is will, and he said that the United States will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. This is what he said in 1961. And then by 1969, and even though Kennedy couldn't see it, the Apollo program put Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. So this is a major victory for the United States in the Cold War. The unpopularity of the Vietnam War leads to President Johnson refusing to run for a second term in 1968. The Democrats are completely splintered over the war. Some of them support it, some of them don't. And some of the more promising candidates like Robert F. Kennedy were killed during the primaries. So Richard Nixon becomes president in 1969. He begins a process called détente, which is pretty much just willing to negotiate and talk to communist countries. The big part of his foreign policy was called Vietnamization, the whole idea being that the South Vietnamese need to be the ones fighting the Vietnam War. So he gradually trained the South Vietnamese army to take over for the Americans in Vietnam. He also is the first president to visit communist China. All the way up until 1972, the United States did not even recognize that it existed. From 1949 to 1972, mainland China was not even considered to be a real country. The United States only worked with what is Taiwan. But in 1972, Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, realized that the Chinese communists and the Russian communists did not get along too well. So they visit China and kind of put a wedge between those two massive communist countries. Nixon also visits Moscow, one of the first times an American president has visited Moscow. And they sign the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, a really important one. The whole idea being, hey, we've got enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 100 times over. Maybe we don't need to make any more. So this is a really significant foreign policy. Nixon did a really great job with that. Unfortunately, when we start talking about his domestic policies, things will be a little different. And then finally, another major aspect of his foreign policy was the oil embargo. When the oil and petroleum exporting countries agreed not to send any oil to countries that support Israel. So can you imagine? I mean, imagine what it would be like here if the United States did not get oil from the Middle East. Imagine how much gas would cost. Imagine how many lines would be out for gas. It would pretty much destroy the American economy. So this was a pretty devastatingly effective thing. However, the United States did not go back on its pledge to support Israel. So again, let's talk about Vietnamization. Nixon explained that they wanted to get more South Vietnamese troops involved and reduce the Americans. His whole slogan for the end of the war was to bring peace with honor. The whole idea being, if you look at it cynically, that the United States would leave this war without looking bad. Let's have peace without looking bad. However, many things during his presidency gets rid of that whole honor aspect. The My Lai massacre, where U.S. troops slaughtered men and women and children. The Pentagon Papers are released, where they talk about, the government officials talk about how they don't care about winning the war. They just don't want to look bad and avoid defeat. So here we have thousands of American soldiers dying. Also, people in the Pentagon and in Washington don't look bad. The effect of Vietnam is pretty significant because it severely limits the power of the presidency after this. The president is allowed to, he's the commander-in-chief, so he's allowed to send troops into countries without approval, but he has to give 48 hours notice to Congress. And if Congress does not authorize the troops to stay after 60 days, then he has to remove those troops in 30 days. So if Congress had disagreed with President Bush's invasion of Iraq, he would have had to have withdrawn the troops within 90 days. And that would have completely changed the way things were in Iraq. This is all because the War Powers Act was passed to prevent anything like Vietnam from happening again. Finally, Nixon and his Secretary of State pretty much give up in the Paris Peace Accords. The United States agrees to pull all troops out of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese are allowed to continue having their troops wherever they are in South Vietnam. And pretty much the United States just abandoned South Vietnam. They also have no aspect of the Paris Peace Accords that addresses the prisoners of war or the soldiers that are missing in action. So they pretty much left 3,000 men on their own, just left them behind in Vietnam. Nobody knows really what happened to them. At some point it may come out, but that's why you see those POW MIA flags all over, because of all those soldiers that were just left behind in Vietnam. Gerald Ford takes over after Nixon is forced to resign, and we'll talk about that when we hit the domestic policy. He's a pretty lame duck president. He only lasts for less than one term, and that's because he's kind of tarred with Nixon's brush there. He was actually a pretty good guy, but he just didn't have much chance. Part of his foreign policy is the end of Vietnam. Of course, he doesn't really take the blame for that. Most of that falls on Johnson and Nixon. He doesn't really last long enough to be too relevant in foreign policy. Jimmy Carter is a Democrat who is elected in 1976, takes over in 1977. It's really not a surprise that he gets elected, considering Nixon and Gerald Ford were pretty well disliked and unpopular in America, so the Democrat won pretty easily. Jimmy Carter kind of takes a bad rap for being a bad president, but he was such a, he's just a little peanut farmer from Georgia, and he was a pretty good guy. He wanted peace. He wanted America to have good relationships with people in South America. So one of the things he did was to sign the Panama Canal Treaty that would eventually give control of the canal back to Panama. However, the United States would not have to pay the tolls as much as other countries, so they kind of kept things for a little bit for themselves. He also begins the Camp David Accords and brings peace between Egypt and Israel, Egypt being the strongest and most wealthy Arab country. So for the first time, Israel is starting to be able to relax a little bit. He signs the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2 with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gets involved in their own Vietnam, and this is when they tried to invade Afghanistan in 1979. Because of that invasion, the United States boycotts the Moscow Olympics in 1980. So things are looking pretty good for Jimmy Carter. I mean, he looks like he's doing a pretty good job, and he cares about peace. However, in Iran, the religious right takes over, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. Once the U.S.-backed Shah of Iran is overthrown, the fundamentalists in Iran take 55 Americans hostage for over a year. Carter tries to negotiate. It's not very successful. He sends special forces in to try to free them, but those guys are caught and captured or killed. This is Operation Eagle Claw. So Carter looks pretty weak. And all at the same time, he's running for re-election against a pretty powerful Republican, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan comes into office and immediately starts flexing American muscle. He does this by supporting resistance movements against communist governments. He says, the only way we're going to have peace is if we have strength. So it's a lot like the walk softly and carry a big stick. He supports the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which ironically, 30 years later, 20 years later, they would be fighting the Americans. Little known fact, well, actually, maybe it's well known now. One of the people that the United States supported during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan was Osama bin Laden. And of course, after the Soviets leave Afghanistan, he begins to turn his attention to the United States. In Lebanon, terrorists bomb the Marine barracks. So, there's a lot of conflict in the Reagan administration. But one thing he does is knock out a possible communist overthrow of the island of Grenada and begins bombing Libya to prevent fundamentalist regimes from taking over. It's a pretty hefty foreign policy for Reagan. One of the biggest factors that kind of was a black eye for Reagan was the Iran-Contra affair. One thing that he was able to do was to get the hostages released from Iran, and how he was able to do that was getting weapons to Iran to fight against Iraq. Again, Iraq was controlled by Saddam Hussein at this time. But, Reagan can't be seen to be selling weapons to Iran. So they come up with this little scheme of selling weapons to Sandinistas selling weapons to Contras in Nicaragua. And the Contras were being funded by Iran. So Iran got a lot of those weapons. And again, this made Reagan look pretty bad. One of the leaders of this little deception was Colonel Oliver North, and you'll want to look at his little link here. But again, this is the 1980s. This is before the Soviet Union has fallen, and Reagan's biggest threat is the Soviet Union. So Reagan realizes that the Soviet Union is suffering. They don't have the economic wherewithal to continue fighting like they are now. So he begins to spend the Soviet Union out of existence. And he does this by creating the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. The idea being to have missiles and lasers all over the United States and the West and in space to knock out any Russian missiles that are sent to the United States or the West. Now, none of these things worked, but the Soviets were scared enough that they continued to try to spend to make this happen. And they spent themselves right out of existence. The leader of the Soviet Union at this time was Mikhail Gorbachev. This guy's still alive now. And he's really the one who is responsible for the end of communism in the Soviet Union through two ways, what is known as glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost was more openness, more freedom of expression in communist countries. They are allowed to have more freedoms. And then perestroika is where they gradually brought capitalism into the Soviet Union. His idea was, hey, this stuff works a little bit. We need to bring it in a little bit so maybe we can continue to exist. But once they let that in a little bit, it was over for the Soviet Union. And after Reagan leaves office, his vice president takes over for one term. George Herbert Walker Bush, the father of George W. Bush, takes office in 1989. The Berlin Wall falls, eliminating Germany as East and West Germany. By 1991, the Soviet Union is fallen. Poland and other Eastern European countries begin to look at democracy. China has democratic revolts, the biggest one being the students in Tiananmen Square. So we see a lot of the growth of democracy in the late 80s and early 90s in America through these two presidents. Probably the biggest foreign policy aspect of George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency is Operation Desert Storm. Saddam Hussein led Iraq to invade a key ally of the United States, Kuwait, and threatened to invade the major ally in the Middle East for the United States, Saudi Arabia. So, President Bush, the first, decides that he doesn't want to get involved in some kind of swampy Vietnam-like conflict in the Middle East, but he can't allow Iraq to do this kind of stuff. So he sends troops into the Middle East to protect Saudi Arabia. He invades Kuwait and knocks Iraq out of Kuwait and sends a little invasion force into Iraq to push them back. And then he stops. He says, we've accomplished all we want to, and that's it. That's all we need to do. His son would take office and try to finish the job, and we'll get to that. But Operation Desert Storm is probably the most important part of his administration. And I remember being a kid and seeing this fight go on, and it was pretty amazing. It was all over television. Heck, they even had made like little baseball cards of Patriot missiles and Bradley tanks. It was pretty crazy what was going on there. Bill Clinton takes office in 1993. He promotes free trade in North America. He sends troops into Bosnia to prevent ethnic cleansing and begins to make America part of a global society. He realizes that the United States cannot just be isolated like they had been for years and years and years before World War II, and that we needed to be a leader, and that's the only way that we were going to continue to be economically better than everyone. This would begin to change by the late 2000s. After Clinton, we have George W. Bush, and most of you know about his war on terror that began with September 11th. His doctrine was we need to attack anybody we think might be a threat to us in the future. So that's why the United States invaded Iraq. You'll hear a lot of people say they invaded Iraq because of 9/11. The Iraqis had nothing to do with that. But he was afraid that Iraq would use weapons of mass destruction on the United States and wanted to stop it. Now it turns out there were no weapons of mass destruction, but the American people were told there were. He also creates the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11 and gets Congress to pass the Patriot Act, which allows a lot of surveillance and pretty shady stuff for the government to do against the United States. Anybody that, may have something against the U.S., including American citizens like you or me, they could see what we borrowed from the library or what we searched for on the internet. That was all part of the U.S. Patriot Act. And then finally, foreign policy up to the present comes to Obama. He ends the occupation of Iraq. He is responsible for capturing and ultimately killing Osama bin Laden. He is at the helm when the Taliban resurges in Afghanistan, and he doesn't really do much to prevent that. It's one of the things that he kind of pushed onto the next people. He was supportive of the democratic uprisings in Egypt, Libya, and Syria. None of those have really worked out too well. And right before he left office, the Ukraine and Russia were a major foreign policy problem that he had to deal with but ran out of time. So it remains to be seen how most of these things are going to end up. It really depends on what President Trump wants to do with most of these things.